So, McKay. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started. I want to introduce to you, hello, should I clap? Go blue. Zero. Stephan is an archaeologist by training, and he's currently an associate professor of practice at the University of Arizona, where he teaches a variety of courses on classical history and civilization, classical mythology, and the reception of classics in the modern world, to name just a few. Rob received his BA from the University of Michigan and his Ph.D. from Stanford University. During his studies, he worked on excavations in Italy, Cyprus, Britain, Armenia, the American Southwest, and currently he is doing his work in Greece. In his free time, Rob spends his Saturdays rooting for his Wolverines, Wildcats, and Cardinals. I asked if he wanted me to give, a good go blue as part of his introduction, and he said he knew that I'd be feeling it inside. But I still wanted to do something to welcome him. So without further ado, and you can feel free to join me. Here we go, Rob Stephan. Here we go. Here we go, Rob Stephan. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Stephan.
I can honestly say that is the greatest introduction I've ever had. How are we doing? Yep. Am I coming through all right there? Great. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Alexandra, for inviting me. This is super exciting. Like Johanna mentioned, I'm a classicist and an archaeologist by training. And so, I've been giving those sorts of presentations for years and years and years, but getting to talk about pedagogy and online pedagogy and really like kind of where my mind is going right now, this is a super exciting opportunity. And I am just absolutely thrilled to be a part of it. Although it is a tough act to follow up Norm here. So I'll try my best. What I'm going to talk a little bit today about are scaling techniques for online courses, right? And I know it says asynchronous online courses. Really, a lot of what I'll be talking about works for asynchronous courses, synchronous courses, hybrid courses, in-person courses. A lot of it's just how do you deal with the hordes and hordes of students in a way that gives them a good experience while not making yourself go crazy. So here's the plan for today. A 5-part thing. We're going to start with a little bit of background on myself here. And the idea is to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and what my experience has been. But also to hopefully kind of, have some people in the audience here and online be able to kind of connect with that sort of thing and see themselves in what I've been doing and maybe give them some strategies moving forward. Then I want to talk a little bit about what's been driving a push towards scale, at least at the University of Arizona. And I think, I'd be very interested to hear from other people what their experiences have been at their own institutions, especially SUNY here. And then the real meat of the conversation today is going to be about different strategies for scaling things. And that's going to be broken into 2 parts. The first is going to focus on kind of content delivery, right? Essentially, what are some strategies that you guys can use to create better looking online lectures, right? And the kind of goal here, my goal with that is not to walk through how do you create, recreate Citizen Kane or whatever the highest, most professional looking thing is, but how can you take a relatively kind of low effort sort of strategy and boost what you have going there. And then we'll talk a little bit about the behind the scenes stuff, right? So how can you kind of deal with the scale of these courses from a kind of structural perspective to, again, provide the students with a really good, high quality experience, while, again, also making sure that you've got time to teach your courses, grade everything, deal with graders and TAs, and again, not kind of lose your mind in doing so. And then hopefully we'll have, 10 or 15 minutes at the end for some questions and discussion. And, with all this stuff, my experience has been that like, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience today, but everybody has their own things that work well for them. And I think that learning from each other is just as important and just as useful as anything I've got to say here. So that is the plan for today. Okay, so background on myself, like Johanna mentioned, I'm at the University of Arizona now. I'm an associate professor of practice, or that's what they call me. I don't really associate with that, or I don't identify with that. Like my sense for an associate or like a professor of practice is like, like a lawyer who teaches a law class, or like an architect who like happens to teach an architecture class. But this is what they call us there. And really what it means is that I'm not a tenured or tenure track professor. And this is something that at least the University of Arizona has been moving towards in recent years. And I think a lot of large state institutions have seen an increase in contingent faculty and a decrease in the hiring of tenure track faculty. And the reason I bring that up is not to knock Arizona, but rather to let you guys kind of know where I'm coming from. And that kind of positionality as a non-tenure track professor has been a lot of what's guided me. Okay, oh, that's fine. Okay, I'll get a little closer to the microphone. Better online? Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so that kind of positionality as a non-tenure track professor has been a big part of what has led me to try to scale some of my classes. My thinking being that, if I can make myself very valuable to the university, then I have to worry a little bit less about my lack of job security. Okay, so my online courses, I teach in classics and I teach archaeology, and the niche that I have found at the University of Arizona are teaching these very large general education courses. So you can see the kind of promotional flyers that I've created here for some of the different courses that I teach. And the reason I wanted to put these up here was to show some of the marketing that you can do to increase enrollments in your own class. But also to give you a sense for, the fact that I'm teaching these general education courses with 500 or 600 people, it's been up close to 1,000 recently, is that like 95% of the people in the class, like hopefully they're kind of sort of interested in the material, but these are not people coming into the class thinking like, oh my goodness, I have to become a classics major. This is going to be my future. They're like, okay, hopefully it's not going to be dreadfully boring. And please, like, at least it will check this box so that I can get my general education credit in humanities and graduate with my degree in physiology or something along those lines. And so that goes a long way in terms of how I've designed these sorts of courses. And as you see here, right, like part of what I do is actually actively trying to recruit students to the class. And I'm going to talk about why that's the case in a second. Now, in addition to these flyers, one of the things that I've done is actually create like little like video trailers. And I'm going to show you one because I get to be the speaker right now. And this is my favorite one. I'm very proud of it. And so again, I'll send these around to students to try to drum up some interest in the class. This is my one on ancient Egypt here. We'll see if it works.
Since the dawn of history, mankind has been bored by, well, history. Until one archaeologist cracked the code. Journey with me to ancient Egypt. To the pyramids of Giza and the temples of Karnak. To to the depths of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. As we decipher the secrets of pyramids and mummies.
All right. Yeah, so that's the goal. That's what I'm trying to get the reaction there. And also to give you a preview about some of the stuff that you guys can do in terms of kind of online lecture design, right? That's a promotional trailer. But this is just me, like there's nothing professional about it. It's just me set up in my house with a camera and a green screen, and then investing some time into video editing. Okay, and so this has been the kind of growth of the classes over time since I've been there. My first class was in 2016. This is a combination of both in-person and online courses, but my first online class, fall of 2016, 21 students, and as of last spring, in spring of 22, you know, my two classes, I actually got a course release, not for the large classes, but because I was also the advisor. And my one had 958 students and the other one had 982. And we'll come back to why that's important in a second. Okay, so what is driving scale, right? Both from my own personal perspective, but also from the perspective of the university. And at the University of Arizona, a big part of this is, well, almost all of it is financial, right? And a big part of it comes from the state. And so over the past 2 decades, the amount of investment that the state has put into the universities has declined dramatically, right? So 15 years ago, we're looking at, you know, a third of the university budget coming from state funding, right? From taxes and things like that. And as of last year, right, that number is much closer to 10% than it is to a third. And so the money needs to be made up somewhere. And where that's come from then is through tuition, right? Student enrollments provide the most of the operating budget for the university. And where they are now is that student funding, right? The money they pay for tuition ends up influencing the way that the budget works, right? So like, I'm sorry that I have to talk about budget here. I hope people don't fall asleep during this, but it's fundamentally important to the way the whole university works and why scaling is important at my institution, at least. We operate under something called activity-informed budgeting. Let me see if I can move this little guy here. There we go. And what this means is that the money in large part follows the students, okay? And so if you're the College of Humanities or the College of Sciences or the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the way you get funding is part of it is the provost decides how much you get. And then part of it is a very simple algorithm. And so you get $3,000 for every degree that you confer on one of your students. You get $350 per major that you have each semester. And then you get $200 to $250 for every student credit hour. And the 200 is if you're teaching somebody on campus, and 250 if they're on the online campus. Now the $3,000 looks like a lot, but if you think of the frequency with which you're doing these things, you'll see that the student credit hours is where almost all of it, right? 95+% of this comes from that. And we can see here what those numbers in terms of the number of students teaching transfers to or translates to in terms of student credit hours, right? 3 student credit hours per student. And then you multiply that by I just put in 225, the average of the two numbers there for each student credit hour. And so last year, you know, is generating something like $2.5 million for the College of Humanities, and then the dean of the college gets to divvy that up however he'd like. And the reason I put this up here is again to show like why this is so important from the university kind of perspective to scale these things, right? Like if they have 60 people teaching those 2,000 students or 3,000 students, you got to pay 60 salaries instead of one of them. And so from their perspective, it's obviously very attractive if you can get somebody to do a good job in those very large classes. The question then would be like, well, okay, it's very clear, at least to me, like why the university wants to scale these things, but like why is it attractive from my perspective to do that? And that's one of the reasons that's the case is that Arizona has actually put in some very good incentives for people to teach at scale. Now, not during the actual year, okay? Like if you teach 9 students or 900 students, like it counts as one class and that's what you do to get your salary. But teaching over the summer, one of the things they've done is they've scaled the pay based on the number of students you teach, at least to some degree. And their thinking there was like, okay, if you want to teach a summer class with 3 students, you're happy to do that. You're welcome to do it, but you're not going to get like a full class salary for teaching those 3 students. And I started thinking about it from the other perspective, like, I'm like pretty motivated by money. I teach a lot of students. The more students I teach during the year, the more students I can teach over the summer, and we can have it like we can like align those incentives so that everybody wins. So that's kind of why it was so appealing to me. Okay, so that's kind of where the drivers are coming from at the University of Arizona. And again, I encourage you to think about, I know the administrators in the room are always thinking about these things constantly, but even if you're a faculty member, right, like thinking about how your university runs and what the budgeting is like, so that you can find a way to contribute in a way that the university itself is going to find very valuable. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to the meat and potatoes part of the presentation today. And that's on kind of some of the strategies for doing this. And again, the goal here is to break this into 2 parts. One being kind of how do you deliver the actual online lectures? And then the other part being kind of how do you do the behind the scenes stuff to deal with the scale of these classes. All right. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people in this room are already familiar with this sort of thing. I was not when I started teaching online, but like, the idea of putting together a 50-minute lecture to mimic your 50-minute in-person lecture turns out to like not work very well, apparently in an online setting. And again, like now I like know that and it's become like second nature, but I didn't know that at the beginning. And one of the recent studies has shown that almost regardless of the length of the lecture, the average time people are going to watch this thing is about 6 minutes. And so 16-minute lecture, they're watching for 6 minutes. 60-minute lecture, they're watching for 6 minutes. For me personally, I aim for about 15 minutes. I tried doing the really short ones, like 5 minutes or so. And like the idea, like at the end, for each module or week, right, students had to watch like 15 of these, and that felt overwhelming to me. And so I do about 15 minutes. But I honestly kind of think that I cover as much in those 15 minutes as I do in about a 50-minute lecture in person. And that's because my online lectures have changed a lot over time, right? Now for the asynchronous courses, I script out everything. One of the things I found, and we're going to watch an example in a second here, is that all the things that make you sound totally normal, like when you're talking live, like repeating yourself and asking rhetorical questions and verbal tics and word fillers and things like that. Like when I saw those in my online recorded lectures, like they ate at me and I dreaded them. And they just sounded so much worse recorded than they did, when I'm teaching a live in-person course. But it took me a very long time to realize that and to implement those things. And so I'll give you a little clip now of my very this isn't even my very first one. This is like year 2 of me teaching online. And I'm sure at the time I felt like I was a very big deal and it was very impressive, but it's the dreaded disembodied voice, where, you know, I've got my PowerPoint slideshow. This is like before the days of Zoom, where I would just narrate my PowerPoint slideshow, and you can see a little clip of it here.
So let's start by going ahead and kind of situating ourselves geographically, right? This is where we've been so far. We started out in the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, right? The area in green here, in particular with the Sumerians down in the southeastern portion of that region, kind of down near the Persian
It's
Gulf.
so painful to watch.
And there, as the Bronze Age, basically, this is,
and it goes on forever.
Love to do is sleep with all sorts of women all the time, and
And
basically,
I think the students still have
what he
no
does
idea what I
here, the
look
way
like
he
at this point.
kind of states the day where you
So yeah, it just goes and goes and goes, and like all the information is there.
instead with Minoan,
Right, like the information I'm conveying is not much different than the information I'm conveying in my updated lectures today. But you know, it's not scripted. It's got, you know, a totally fine but not super exciting kind of PowerPoint attached to it. I am nowhere to be found. I don't think the students knew what I looked like there. And so that was the early iteration, and I wanted you to see that, because it's, you know, it's not going to be that much extra effort from this to create something that I think is much more effective and looks a lot better. So during the pandemic, right, we all became very familiar with Zoom, and really they made recording these things like relatively easy, right? And when you share your screen and you narrate your PowerPoint, it does the nice little thing of putting you up in the corner. This is just something I recorded in the past couple of days here, but it looks something like this, right?
Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the rise of Bronze Age societies.
I don't know why the audio is
Before we
off,
get into
but
the specific societies, let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of the Bronze Age. One of the main things we get here is the stratification and specialization within social roles in ancient societies. So, for example, we get the rise of political hierarchies, like you see here with good old King Tut in Egypt. You also end up with religious hierarchies, so formal priesthoods and things of that nature. You also get military hierarchies and the rise of the soldier becoming a real professionalized role within societies like ancient Egypt, the Hittites, and in other Near Eastern societies as well.
Okay, so at least at my university, that's more or less the norm in terms of kind of what an online lecture looks like, right? Somebody's sharing their slides online, and then they've got the little like person in a box. And really, I think actually just having the person in the box is a big step in the right direction, right? Having your students be able to see you is meaningful, right? They want to know who they're learning from, and they want to be able to see you as a person, rather than some kind of disembodied voice. Nonetheless, I still thought, like, for me, like, it irked me, like it didn't feel very clean, like, or polished. And so as I continued, like, you know, during the pandemic, I started thinking, you know, where can we go? You know, where can we go from here? Let's see. There we go. And I started trying to think of this, right, from a kind of design thinking perspective, from a student centered perspective, and thinking like, okay, it's not that like students don't like watching things. Students love watching things. And it turns out that like what some of them like watching, what a lot of them like watching is people playing video games. And I myself, like, I love video games. Video games are great. I like playing video games on the weekend. I use them in some of my classes. I have a lot of fun with it. I never have I like been like, ooh, I want to go watch somebody else play video games. But apparently, like, this is what kids are doing these days. And you can see in some of the numbers here, right? Like how many millions of followers some of these top video game streamers have, and how that translates into kind of millions of dollars of revenue for those people. And so I started thinking, okay, like, well, what are they doing, and how can I capture some of that? And so this is more or less kind of what it ends up looking like for the most part on a site like Twitch, where you've got the video game in the background, right? The person watching can see what's going on as you play the game. You've got the chat over on the side, and then you yourself are in one of the corners. And I looked at it and I was just like, man, that just looks more polished than the kind of Zoom version of an online lecture, right? Like, I like the cutout. This was a big part of what got me thinking of this kind of green screen thing. Like, can I layer myself on top of my lectures so that it starts to look a little bit more natural and like integrated, rather than me set off to the side in a separate box? And what I want to do now is just show you a minute or two of what one of those kind of lectures looked like. This is actually from a Asynchronous course that I did during the pandemic. But the principles behind it apply to really synchronous, asynchronous, any sort of online design. And the thinking here is, yeah, again, to kind of make it look to the student, right, like that I'm a part of the lecture so that they can see the professor. So we'll watch a little bit of this, and then I'm going to take you through the kind of practical steps for how to actually do this thing. Let's see here.
Now, the story we
Start at the...
All right, let's get this party started. Welcome, students, to Classics 160B1. Meet the Ancients.
I also
I'm
find the
Chris.
weirder you can be, the better.
I'm Stephan, and we are here to finish up week 9 today. This is putting us 60% of the way through the course, so we're getting there. I think we have less than 2 months to go. I hope everybody is on the seat of their chair, just like dying to hear how Roman history evolves, because that's what you're going to get for the second half of the course. So hopefully that's what you're excited about. Anyway, what we are doing today is we are going to finish our story about Rome's earliest days with lecture 9.3, the 7 Kings of Rome. We're going to start with a few announcements. We are going to, he's got his dad and
this is how it goes as I go through the lecture.
Hooked up with Aphrodite.
Having the
He's
screen
got his son Ascanius on his leg.
having the screen behind me allows me to kind of sort of interact with the slides in a certain way. And so this ended up being kind of the outcome of trying to turn myself into a video game streamer. And at the beginning, it took me a while to figure all this out. The software I was using at the time is called OBS Studio, or Open Broadcaster Studio. It's free software, costs nothing. But what I want to go through, I'll give you the step-by-step for how to do this, is actually not doing that because it's a little bit more complicated than the new thing I figured out here, which is that you can actually do all of this through Zoom itself, which I had no idea was actually possible and is super duper easy. But first things first, okay, the first step to doing this, I'm sure many of you guys already have this sort of setup. Where I am at the University of Arizona, especially with a lot of people going online with the pandemic, who had no experience teaching online before, the default was you get out your laptop, which has a webcam and microphone built into it, and you record your lecture doing that. And it's fine, right? Like, I mean, it's not terrible. It's fine. But what I want to make the pitch for here is that with a relatively small investment, you can produce something that looks a lot better, right? And these are the 4 things that I think you need. You need a dedicated webcam, right? Really, the C920 from Logitech is like a decade old or something now, and it still looks really good. And if you want to go for something 4K, either Logitech's Brio or the Insta360 Link, the Rolls Royce of webcams, looks really good. And you can get the Brio for $200 and the Insta360 for $300. Same thing with audio, right? Like, get yourself a USB mic. The Blue Yeti is like one of the industry standards, and that's around $100. But you can get a $25 mic or something on there, and it still sounds way better than what's built in. Lighting, right? Getting yourself a little light so that you're not in the shadow. That's really cheap these days. And then what you get to get the kind of polished, kind of cut out effect is a green screen, and I use Elgato's here. All these are linked, and I'll give you the link to the presentation here afterwards. But that ends up being, it's under $200. So my kind of point here is that for $500, you guys can get a relatively professional looking kind of home studio going. So start emailing your department heads and asking for money and saying that the SUNY Online Summit told me that I had to do this. And yeah, so you can get a sense here. This is what my home office and looks like. It's not a ton of stuff, right? Like, it's a computer. I like the giant monitor. Then you got the light, you got a microphone, and then you can see on the right-hand side there, I've got the setup with the green screen as well. And that just pushes down and folds up, and you can put it under your bed or in your closet or in the corner of the room or wherever. So it doesn't have to be up all the time. So that's kind of the starting point there. Now, in terms of how to actually do this, this is the kind of full overview here, but I want to go through step by step. Like I was saying, you can do this on Zoom now. I only learned this like a month ago or something. But step number one is setting up the green screen. And here's the key for that, right? When you do it, you've got to make sure that this covers like the entire camera area. Okay. Like, if you have like a bookshelf in the back because the screen doesn't cover the whole thing, that bookshelf is going to be showing through on the camera. So those higher priced webcams can zoom in and make sure that you get it. Otherwise, you just got to make sure it's kind of close to the camera. But that's step one. Step two, designing your PowerPoint, right? Like, I like this little thing. I like the little like pull down screen there, and I think it makes it look like you're in a lecture hall or something like that. You can make it look however you want. But the key here is when you're designing for something like this, you got to make sure that you leave room for yourself, right? So like, I do that over on the right-hand side of the screen, but you don't want to be like covering up important key information. And so you got to have kind of everything shifted one direction. Then you got to, once you pull up Zoom, right, tell it that you have a green screen. And you can do that by going to video settings and then background and effects. And then there's just a little box at the bottom that says I have a green screen, letting the software know. And then here's the kind of trick that I only picked this up like a month ago, but you go to share screen, just like we're doing on Zoom right now. And the key is, rather than staying on that first page and choosing your PowerPoint or your, browser or whatever else it is, you go to the advanced button at the very top up there, right? So you can see where I've got it circled in red. And again, I'll distribute all these slides so you can walk through this yourself at your leisure. And when you do that, you get a new set of choices. And the first one there is PowerPoint as virtual background. And if you put that in there and you choose your file, it then stitches it together for you, right? This is the easiest, kind of lowest effort way to create that sort of effect. And what you can do then is, you can drag your little webcam video of yourself to whichever corner of the screen you'd like to be in. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller. I like to make myself a little bigger on the screen there. And then, you just click through like you normally would with your presentation, and it gives you that kind of effect, like you are now a part of the slides or in front of the slides rather than in a box set off to the side. So that's like the kind of whatever 5 or 6 step process to make this thing happen in Zoom. And it's really, it's a couple $100 of equipment, which your university should definitely be paying for. And then, it'll take you an hour the first time to really figure it out. And then after that, you're talking an extra 5 minutes in terms of, pulling the green screen up and putting it down while you give your lecture. And the cool thing here, right, is this works now for both asynchronous courses, right? You can just record yourself at home, but it also works if you're teaching synchronously, and you can kind of give that vibe to your students, like you're in a classroom or they're in a classroom learning. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about how to do it with OBS here, but this is how I started, and it's a little bit more complicated, but it's also a little bit more powerful. And so what this allows for is, it's kind of like if you've ever played with Photoshop or Adobe Premiere or Adobe Rush or something like that, the idea that things layer like one on top of another, that's like the basic sense for this, but for streaming and recording. And so you go under sources and you select your webcam as one source, and you select your whatever you want in the background as another source, right? It could be a PowerPoint, but what this lets you do is put anything back there, right? The video game streamers are putting their video game feed from their computer back there. You can make it a video game feed, you can make it a movie, you can make it animations. It allows you to get those effects of like, the screen coming down, or, switching between a PowerPoint and a video game or something like that. And so it's a little bit more high powered. You got to put a filter on your webcam feed to get the kind of green part of the screen to disappear there. And then you can record it. So again, if you're looking for a slightly more high powered version, that's a great way to go. And the software is totally free. Now, one of the next questions I had, right, well, after playing around with all this was like, do the students care at all, right? Like I care, I create it. And I'm like, this is awesome, right? I'm teacher of the year. And like I had no idea whether the students are just like sitting there like, this is so dumb, I hate this. And so last year I decided, all right, I'm gonna do like to the best of my ability a preliminary study on this thing. And so what I did is I went through all my evaluations since I'd been there teaching online courses, which ended up being 73 different sections, almost 2,000 responses. And I tried to run a study to see whether we can see any quantitative trends in terms of how kind of the production value of classes ends up correlating with student reviews, right? And again, this is all student reviews, so it's their perceptions of things, right? It's not measuring things like actual learning outcomes or anything like that, but it's a starting point. And so the kind of condensed version here is I grouped all these different things into 4 different kind of styles of lecture, everything from like the unscripted PowerPoint that you saw earlier that was super painful to kind of the, slightly more professional styles that I've tried to do more recently. And you can watch some of these on your own. We already watched that one. University of Arizona has their own recording studio, right? So this is an example of one where people like put me in an actual studio and other people
run through the
recorded me,
origins of the
a more
city of Rome.
bearded version of myself.
It all begins with our hero Aeneas fleeing the burning remains of Troy. So he's always depicted.
And you
with
can
his
see it moves
father
back and forth
Anchises
between
on
me
his
and the
back
scene and
his
the
son
actual
Ascanius.
slides. So that's one way to do it. And then this is an example of kind of the most recent version for my asynchronous classes where I've actually started scripting things out and then messing around things with things in Adobe Premiere. So this is actually the Egypt class that you saw the trailer for earlier.
It was in the 5th year of his reign.
And it kind of moves back and forth
Amenhotep
between kind of
changed his name to Akhenaten,
moving
which
10
translates
style
as
pictures and then
effective for the Aten. And from here on out, you're portrayed as the disk of the sun, with rays emerging with small hands on the end, sometimes giving out.
So here, on this stela from Amarna, we can see Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti making offerings to the Aten.
And so that just gives you one kind of example of what, the different kind of versions of courses that I group things into for this study here. And then I grouped the questions within a couple categories as well, right? Kind of overall quality questions, questions about student learning, questions about clarity, free response questions that mentioned the lectures as a particularly positive thing. And then ran the regression between kind of the dummy variable for the quality of the course 1 through 4 and the quantitative scores that came out of those. And I know the numbers here don't look very exciting, but the fact that there is like a consistent relationship I thought was interesting and reassuring that like the work was not for naught. And what I was really surprised about is that the kind of strongest correlation came about in the category of student learning. And again, that's self-perceptions of student learning rather than kind of like measuring learning outcomes, which would be a future version of the study. But nevertheless, I thought it was like pretty encouraging, right? That you see like an R squared value of like 0.33 for the question, like, how much have you learned in this course? Means that 33% of the variation in student scores can be explained by the kind of production value or style of the course. So that's just like, that's again, a preliminary kind of study, but it jumped out to me like, all right, like students at least feel like they're getting something about the extra effort that we're putting into these lectures. Okay, my last thing today, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of behind the scenes stuff, right? What I wanted to do previously there was just give you some kind of easy ways to really make your own online video lectures stand out and pop compared to what else is out there these days. Now I want to take a look behind the scenes. And when you're dealing with 500 or 600 or 1,000 students, right? The problem is that everybody is here because they want to do an awesome job teaching, right? Like we care about our students, we care about their learning. We want to, even in online courses, we want to treat them as people and as individuals. We want to give them personalized feedback. But when the numbers are that big, just doing it logistically is really difficult, right? And so the basic kind of solution that I've come up with that you're going to see in a couple different variations here is going to be that, I've tried to create systems where I can pseudo personalize things for the students. And I don't mean that, like, I really don't mean that in a bad way, right? Where they're feeling like they're getting a personalized experience, but it's standardized enough from my end that A, it's going to give the students some consistency across like my interaction with them, across the graders, the TAs, right? Provide some consistency there. They're going to feel like it's a little bit more personal than maybe it would be otherwise. And it's also going to give me some time to do other things like, try to go through all these teaching evaluations and run studies and things like that, because otherwise I would just be drowning in the logistics of the course. And I wanted to start here with emails. Like when the courses really started getting big, I'm sure everybody who's taught large courses has felt this at one point or another. And the issue was, right, like, if you have 50 students in a course and 10% of them don't understand something in email you, right? Like you get, 5 emails, right? If you have 500 students, then you have 50 emails. And if you have 1,000 students, then you have 100 emails. And like, a lot of times the emails are like, oh, like Dr. Stephan, like my grandmother died and, something really tragic. And like, can I have a couple extra days on the assignment? And I was at the point where I'd be responding and be like, yeah, sure. Take a couple days, which is like, fine, right? It conveys the information that they need to know for their assignment, but it's not like this person's grandmother just died. Like, you don't want to you want to respond in a kind and compassionate sort of way, but like writing that out each and every time, something kind of, an illness or a family situation or what, a mental health situation happens is really difficult. And so sometime about 2 years ago that I decided like, I've got to start standardizing some of this. And so what I did was like, I got myself a Google Doc and I just started creating templates. Now the Google Doc is 32 pages long, and you guys can access this here. And when Billy isn't feeling well and he emails me, now instead of just saying, yeah, sure, take a couple days, I can just go down to the old homework extension tab and say, I'm so sorry to hear things have been so tough. I'm really proud of you for working so hard to fight through this adversity. If you need more than a week, then you can contact the dean of students and here's the information for that. And I'm rooting for you. And now I can feel like I have written a kind and considerate email that if I had to write that thing out from scratch each time, I would just, it would break me. And I don't have the bandwidth to do that. And so, I've got these now for everything from students wondering about extra credit. Thanks for reaching out. Really happy you want to do the best you can in the class. Unfortunately, there's no extra credit, but here's all the different things you can do. Instead of just saying no. And what I've tried to do then is take take this kind of mindset and this set of like, building systems that in the moment are going to take a lot more time than I normally would, right? Like writing the one email that says, oh, I'm so sorry, and like I want to help you and all that stuff. That takes more than just saying, yeah, turn it in 3 days. But now I'm going to get the payoff for that as I go through the rest of the course and the rest of my other courses. The same thing here. We don't have to go into a ton of depth on it. Came to training graders and TAs, right? Any given semester or any given year, I've probably got between 10 and 30 different people in terms of grading support, which is fantastic. Like, I'm really happy that Arizona is giving me that support, but 2/3 of them have no expertise in the field. They're coming from all over the place. Frequently, they're master's students who are a year older than the students that they're teaching, no experience. And so eventually I was like, I got to standardize this stuff. And so it was the same kind of thing. It was like, build one of these templates and just start putting everything I can in there so that they have a resource to do this. And it's everything from like, what's the deal with TAing to like, what are all the things you are going to find frustrating when your students email you and they're just like, hey, yeah, I'm not going to turn my work in this week. And like, it's frustrating when people don't like address you as a person and like trying to give them the heads up that that's going to happen. And that like, when that happens, you've got to respond not in the same way, right? You've got to say, dear whoever, right? Thank you so much for getting in touch. And now you've got a template for how to do these things. Same thing with rubrics, same thing with grading. There we go. So again, that's a resource you can get on there and take a look at it and, download it and use it however you'd like. Tailor it to exactly what you want to do. Grading early on, I was not a rubric fan. Now I cannot live without the rubrics. And many people have used the online rubrics before. What I found particularly useful for what I'm trying to do in terms of personalizing this stuff is using and improving the kind of auto feedback function, right? So that like when a TA, right, clicks on level 3 of the quality of the response, right, the student, what they get is, oh, like, well done creating a unique origin story. You've created a symposium of quality, like a symposium quality tale here, but I think you still have some room to improve. And that way, it feels to the student like they're getting something personalized. The next time that they do this for the next module, all those things are going to be changed. And it takes a long time to build all that. But if you just start doing it incrementally, you're going to get to the point where they all look really tailored and really, really polished. And same thing with personalized feedback, right? I give all these to my TAs so that they don't have to type out when they do give the really personalized feedback to the students, the stuff that's actually personalized, that they don't have to write out the pros each time, right? That they can just put in the student's name, put in their name, put in actually what's going well, actually where students can improve, rather than writing that kind of fluff around it as well. One final thing as I wrap up here. One of the things that I've started using in the past year or two, and you'll see it from all the Google Docs I'm doing here, I'm trying to move away from like hard copies of things. And I mean like hard digital copies there, right? Like PDFs and things like that, where like they can look really nice, but I know this has happened to a lot of people where like, especially in the big classes, I'll send something out and it'll have like the word count from like last year's version of the class. And I wanted to change that. And so I send out like the new assignment thing. And then like, that's got a different word count, but the students, they didn't read the new email and now they're working off of the old one. And now there's like multiple versions of the assignment sheet floating around. And they just like, it's very like, it leads to a lot of problems and a lot more emails. And then I got to go adapt the template again. And so what I've started to do are create these kind of single source things for like assignment sheets and syllabi and almost everything I can, right? And Google Docs and Adobe Express web pages are a great way to do that. So what lives in the course website is simply the link. And so students always click on, to access any assignment, students will click on the link. There we go. And that brings them to whatever the web page is, right? This one's on how to produce a video about some artifact that they're doing research on. And if in section 4, right? I've totally botched something. Now, instead of having to like redo the file and then resend it out, and now there's multiple versions, right? I just fixed the master page, and students, when they access it next time, it's been changed automatically. They don't have access to the old version anymore. And I found that like, it's something that I'm still like kind of new at, but I've found that very, very valuable as I've in the past couple of years, to avoiding that problem of students having multiple versions of things and not knowing which one is correct. Yeah, finally, things like syllabi. This is my old like, kind of PDF version of the thing. But this is a great example, I think, of where we can put in a lot of work on things that don't change very often, right? At least at the University of Arizona, we have so many policies in our syllabi now that it's like, this is a 58-page document. It's crazy, right? And like 6 words change between different offerings of the course. So I thought, okay, well, like, let's just make the policies and things like that like look kind of nice at least once. And then all I have to do, right? Like, so, you've got all your policies on attendance, and I'm sure it'll take a while for it to all load up here. Student resources, the different assignments. And the only thing that changes is when I get down to the bottom and I've got the actual course schedule. And even within that, like, the assignments aren't changing that very frequently. All that's changing are the due dates. So like the only thing that gets changed between courses is I just go change the due date. And because I sunk all that time into the design the one time, I'm getting the payoff on that each time I teach the class, even though, each subsequent iteration takes, 3 minutes to go update February 19th to whatever, October 3rd. So that is a little bit about kind of my experience trying to scale these classes. Again, it's not like super research-based. It's much more my kind of own personal experience, but some things that I've found that are relatively low effort, that have a relatively high payoff, and that I hope helps you guys facilitate and run really high quality classes as you continue to grow your enrollments here at SUNY and beyond. So thank you very much.